Okay, we are live.
Good afternoon. My name is Pia Nieminen from the EIB Brussels office, and I would like to warmly welcome you to this lunch dialogue on biodiversity. We are organizing this together with Caisse de dépôt, CDC. This dialogue is very timely, as last week the Commission adopted a very important legislative proposal on nature restoration law, which would require all member states to restore nature. And their investments are needed. And today's lunch dialogue is focusing on that, accelerating investments in biodiversity, how to identify and screen bankable projects. Few housekeeping rules to begin with. We have 1 hour for this dialogue. We will start with the presentations, and then you, audience, are welcome to post your questions in a Q&A box on the right-hand side, and they will be directed to our moderator, who is today Sophie Barbier, and she is the head of European Affairs in CDC, Caisse de dépôt. And with her team, she is responsible for following interests of CDC group at European level. And biodiversity is, of course, one of the topics for the important dimension for CDC sustainable investment policies, but also for one of the subsidiaries, which is CDC Biodiversity. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Pia. Yes, 1 out of 8 birds, 1 out of 4 mammals, 1 out of 3 amphibians are at threat of extinction. 75% of genetic diversity of agricultural crops has been lost. 75% of the world's fisheries are fully or overexploited. More than 80% of European habitats are in poor condition. I could go on with many other indicators pointing at the same phenomenon. Global biodiversity is falling at an alarming rate. So this sharp fall is linked to economic activities, of course, which require the use of land and water, cause greenhouse gases emissions and environmental pollution, and consequently induce losses of biodiversity. That is why, as Pia reminded us, investing in activities that minimize such negative impacts, or still better, generate positive impacts on biodiversity, is key if we want to stop and revert this alarming trend. We collectively face a major challenge at a time when biodiversity losses accelerate. How can we define targets and policies in order to channel investments toward projects that preserve biodiversity? This is this major challenge that our distinguished panelists have courageously accepted to address today at the invitation of EIB during this lunch dialogue. So maybe before launching this dialogue, I would like to introduce briefly our panelists who are leading experts of this issue. So ladies first, Eva Meyerhofer, a marine biologist by training, the head of Environment Policy Unit and lead biodiversity specialist at the European Investment Bank. Her work focuses on the EIB efforts to support EU and international biodiversity policies, develop business models and financing instruments to support nature-positive investments, and build an understanding within the EIB of biodiversity and ecosystem risks and impacts, including valuation and accounting. Humberto Delgado Rosa is the Director for Biodiversity in the DG Environment of the European Commission, previously Director for Mainstreaming, Adaptation and Low Carbon Technology in DG Climate Action. He's experienced in European and international environmental policy, particularly in biodiversity and climate change issues. He served as Secretary of State for the Environment of the Portuguese government from March 2005 to June 2011. Between 1995 and 2002, he was an advisor for environmental matters to the Prime Minister of Portugal. He holds a PhD in evolutionary biology. Finally, Marc Abadi has a triple experience in the private sector, in NGOs, as companies such as Saint-Gobain or regional newspapers, in local authorities, especially as CEO of a water agency and deputy CEO of Région Île-de-France, and as high civil servant in various departments, Home Office, local authorities, overseas departments, agriculture and ecology, and at the head of the General Inspection of Administration. He's today heading CDC Biodiversity, an operator specialized in innovative nature-based solutions. So I warmly thank them for having accepted to participate in this panel. Many thanks also to EIB for having organized this dialogue. Without further ado, I would like to launch this discussion by asking a first question to Umberto. The EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 is a major part of the European Green Deal. It aims to put Europe's biodiversity on a path to recovery by 2030. Umberto, could you set the scene for this discussion and tell us more about the EU targets that derive from this EU biodiversity strategy? Has the European Commission assessed the investment needs associated to these objectives?
Thank you very much, Sophie. And first, thanks to the EIB and CDC Biodiversity for this event, this lunchtime conference. Let me go directly first into scene setting. Well, I would say first, for us not to forget, we are often used to think about crises of several sorts, like climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, pandemics, now the war. But I would say first that some of these crises are more structural and ongoing, that will remain. The others are more conjunctural. And the first ones, climate change, biodiversity loss, etc., are the more fundamental ones, and I think can be subsumed into one, which is a global sustainability or rather unsustainability crisis that we face, one of the faces of which is the loss of biodiversity. Indeed, the Green Deal as such was a political response to this, bringing to the same level of importance of climate change the rest of the environment, including biodiversity. Thus, we have this biodiversity strategy for 2030, indeed very ambitious and more quantifiable than before. It does have a series of quantified targets. This is not at all small relevance for the economy. And for me, the World Economic Forum estimates that over half of the world's total GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature and these services. Has been a very good wake-up call, together with the risk assessment that WEF, the World Economic Forum themselves, do. So we should not forget that we are all strictly dependent on the services that the biosphere provides us, and that this covers all economic aspects we can have. So what the biodiversity strategy does is setting targets indeed, but subsuming to them this idea as nature as a solution for several angles, from agriculture production to forestry, fisheries, health, and so forth. So this perception that we must accelerate investments in nature, on land and seas, yes, protection, but also restoration, also putting green infrastructure where it is needed, such as within cities, and or in the margins of rivers to prevent floods. This is the kind of thinking that is more and more needed. Now, this is, let's say, on the targets as such, but how to make biodiversity more attractive to investors? First, yes, we did identify costs and benefits, and also the amounts of investment needed. We estimate as 20 billion years per year for this next period of investment. And for that, we can have both public and private finance coming in. But indeed, it's important to make more, to scale up the efforts of green finance, financing the green and greening the finance sector in a way. So that's for why issues like the ones we are discussing today, like measuring the biodiversity footprint for a project, is indeed an important step to identify what are the good projects for nature and the environment. And there are many activities ongoing towards that. In the EU Business and Biodiversity Platform, we do assess different available biodiversity measurement methods to make them more accessible to businesses and financial institutions. The Global Biodiversity Score of CDC Biodiversity being a very good example. But we are also financing through live projects initiatives so as to bring in natural capital accounting principle standards. So measurement and evaluation of impacts on biodiversity. We have the Project Align, we have the Project Transparent, which is developing common applicable natural capital accounting principles. So I would just add, of course, measuring the footprint as such is relevant, but business also needs tools to know their risks and dependencies. And this is where natural capital accounting, including as appropriate, the monetization of the values from nature and biodiversity is very relevant. So it is said, maybe I would just add that on bringing investments directly into nature, we did have this very interesting pilot with the EIB and also with DG Klima, because already their climate and biodiversity were quite linked, the natural capital financing facility to finance projects directly on nature or on nature for climate adaptation purposes. And we have had some quite very interesting projects approved, but we also learned several difficulties, such as projects are often too small or the returns on investment are too long. There are many nice ideas on how to use nature, but they are often far from becoming bankable, and the nature-related actors often fail on the economic side. So there are many issues that we have learned from this NCFF experience and that we trust will feed into EIB's operations in the future, as well as into the InvestEU as such. So the final word, I refer to InvestEU. I think it will be very critical, this InvestEU program in this period 2021-2027, to increase public and private investments for the implementation of the Green Deal overall, but within the Green Deal and the InvestEU, we need, of course, to invest on biodiversity. And we have allocated some 50 million from the LIFE program just to strengthen the green technical advisory of the InvestEU Advisory Hub, so as to make sure that nature projects also kick in. There are other initiatives ongoing. We have the taxonomy that will also include biodiversity criteria, and indeed the EU Nature Restoration Law was presented, the proposal of the Commission was presented last week, and I honestly think it's the most important nature-related piece of legislation since the Habitats Directive, showing very clearly, yes, there's a war ongoing, but the narrative and the objectives in the Green Deal remain even more important. Maybe I stop here and we can develop further in the following debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Umberto. So many doors open on different subjects. Thank you for this. And maybe since investment is crucial, I would like to turn to Eva and see concretely how a bank, the European Investment Bank, translates these ambitious objectives into its investment policy. So maybe, Eva, could you describe a little bit your own investment policy and the way you screen and assess projects against these principles that Umberto has reminded us, and these targets?
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, Umberto, for setting the scene and actually pointing out on some of the key elements as to how an MDB or multilateral development bank, such as or public institution as the EIB, will operate or should operationalize some of these commitments and targets. And one of the points I want to highlight that Umberto mentioned is about financing green and greening finance, and this is what we do. So in terms of the in terms of biodiversity per se, I mean, we try to adopt the two strategic goals under the strategic plan for biodiversity that came to an end in 2020 of the CBD. One was to address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss by mainstreaming biodiversity across the institution, but the other one is also to reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity and promote sustainable use. And this has been quite challenging as an institution, and we have to keep in mind we are a bank and we are a project financing institution. So one of the first line, if you will, of defense is the setting or the tools is setting standards to reduce the risk. So to reduce the risks in terms of having environment, climate, and social policies and standards that are leading the benchmark, in particular with reducing the risks to biodiversity. And one of the aspects that we have now done in the revision of our environmental and social sustainability framework, which is harmonized with those of the other multilateral development banks, is the move towards a no loss of biodiversity policy from a no net loss. So what that means, it doesn't mean that we won't be financing any projects anymore, but the focus is very much in line with the EU Biodiversity Strategy 2030 on focusing on key priority species, whereas no net loss is an accounting methodology that does not automatically focus on high biodiversity value. It's to get a general, let's say, no net loss of biodiversity, also compensating with biodiversity that is of lesser value. But here it's really trying to protect the key ecosystems and key biodiversity species that are critical to maintaining the integrity of such ecosystems. Now, what that also implies is that we have moved away from offsetting. So offsetting is no longer an acceptable measure for net gain in critical habitats, or if we use the terms under EU biodiversity legislation, for species under strict protection. And this is, I think, a significant move together with the Inter-American Development Bank. We are the two only institutions that are no longer going to be considering offsets as an acceptable measure for net gain. And that means a focus on restoration, and a focus on restoration on site, which will come with the challenges that certainly, Sophie, you have mentioned in your introduction, and Umberto. So this is the first point, but we don't stop there. In terms of standards, of course, we work with different partners. We were one of the leaders in setting the sustainability principles and standard for the blue economy, but we're also working with the World Economic Forum and other organizations, for example, in the Asia and Pacific region, on looking at biodiversity credit markets, but not for offsetting, but looking at these biodiversity credit markets from an integrity, looking at these markets, setting up these markets to be able to finance restoration, to be able to also protect high biodiversity value sites. So it's looking at also principles under green bonds, ensuring coherence, integrity, and implementability. So that's the first side, is of course looking at implementing those standards across all our operations. But then I think something that resonated with us is, of course, the whole area of risk management, and risk management at counterparty level, but also looking at the exposure to financial risks linked to biodiversity. And I think one of the aspects that is important is that if capital markets were to adequately price the cost of destroying nature, maybe, and this is a point I mean, I'd like to discuss with others, we may have seen a larger share of the recovery packages go to restoration and nature-based solutions. But unfortunately today, I mean, we are really at the infancy stages of really pricing the cost of destroying nature. I'm not saying putting a price on nature, but really on what it means destroying nature, and understanding that destroying nature means that we destroy our economy. And I think this is all already sinking in. So what the EIB hasn't gone down yet the route of footprinting. We are really at the initial stages, but this is something that we in the long run will be developing a methodology based on the fantastic methodologies, of course, that CDC has developed, and borrowing elements of that, because we are a project financing institution and therefore finance a lot of infrastructure projects. But we are looking at two aspects. One is integrating, we do an economic appraisal for all our projects. So integrating really the biodiversity and ecosystem externalities into our economic appraisal. So including lookup values or transfer values into, and understanding those trade-offs. This follows a bit what we have learned from the climate sphere of introducing the shadow price of carbon. So that's what we're trying to do on the biodiversity and ecosystem side. Very challenging because biodiversity is very local and also very diverse. And given the fact that we finance globally, that has created a number of challenges. But we hope that with our economists, we will overcome some of these challenges and have current valuation evidence base, including rule of thumbs and benchmarks, at least for that initial assessment. And even if the system is not perfect, what I want to maintain is we need to start somewhere and build on those systems as we go along, as we learn more, as we develop more of the science-based evidence. And then that follows, of course, very much the work that the Dasgupta review has put forward, and is an important part of our risk management. And then that the final point I want to also introduce is the risk management, the risk categorization of our counterparts. And there again, we are looking at building on the climate risk score for our counterparts, looking at how they incorporate their exposure to climate risk and then their exposure to biodiversity risk, what that means. But it is also important that the net zero commitments that companies have made, corporates and financial institutions have made in terms of climate, cannot be achieved without the incorporation of nature and biodiversity. And so now we are looking at those transition plans, not only from a purely climate lens, but also incorporating a nature and biodiversity lens. Because otherwise, it's no point them, they won't be achieving their 1.5 targets. I'll stop there because I think Marc will certainly have more concrete examples, and I'm happy to then develop on the financing side later on.
Thank you, Eva. So no need for me to introduce more the subject. I think that you referred to the Global Biodiversity Score as an example of the what can be done in terms of measure, and you underlined that impacts. It's important to be able to measure impacts to be able to manage them. So maybe, Marc, you could tell us more about this GBS and the way you can assess the biodiversity footprint of projects.
Hello, thank you, Sophie, thank you, Umberto, and thank you, EIB, for the invitation. First of all, Umberto and Sophie, and even Eva, you have bring us the big pictures. The situation is very bad, and we are all looking for results for restoration of biodiversity. And I will insist that the document the European Commission published last week is very important, because it is the first time for me that there is a clear regulation will be in Europe. And I think it's very important to know that the European Commission will be in the front row for the COP15 with such a regulation. And just a few words and example after. A few general words. CDC Biodiversity was launched in 2008, and we have a clear motto that you can't manage what you can't measure. And we have also a clear target, Eva. We are for the net gain solution. We don't think, even if part of our job is offsetting, we don't think that the net zero approach is a good one, because we must restore and progress for biodiversity. So in 2070s, we find that it was time to reach a real challenge to create a footprint for biodiversity, the GBS, the Global Biodiversity Score. For 4 years, we worked with 15 French companies, and in 2020, the GBS was a reality after two main choices. To have a scientific review, because we take all the EPBS question except the invasive species, which is impossible by now. And also we adopt a very well-known standard, which is the MSA, the mean space abundance per square kilometers, which was developed by the Dutch institution and at the demand of the EPCC. And for us, it is a success. There is also, as Umberto said, also initiative in Europe, in Brazil, in many countries, but we think we have a robust and as simple as possible footprint. And nowadays, 20 major companies in Europe have adopted GBS, Schneider Electric, as everybody knows, but also Sweden company has Waterfall, you know, electricity supplier, Nestle, and you have also Hermes, you have also Decathlon, you have many companies in a very wide range of activities. Since last year, we have developed a GBS for financial activity, and Eva, our partner to develop this, is a very special partner because it is the best well-known company in France for carbon assessment. So we propose to the financial institution both carbon assessment and biodiversity assessment. It is the company's name, Carbon for Finance, and it is a real success. And as you know, it will be mandatory in France to have a biodiversity report by the end of this year. And we are still working because we have 3 new footprints which are under progress. A footprint for local authorities to assess public policy at a local level in town council for water, for drinking water, for sanitation, public transport, urban planification, wetland, and so on. And I think it will be available next year. It is very important also for EIB. We are developing what we call the index for local project for biodiversity, with 12 French public and private companies who are working to have an index project by project, project of infrastructure, project of construction, real estate, and so on and so on. And because GBS is only for large company, we will launch at, I think it is in September, a new approach for small and middle cap and businesses. And to be concrete, Eva, I just want to talk about a program which is called Nature 2050, which is a nature-based solution program. We have launched 6 years ago. It was in 2016, and we presented it at European Nature Summit last year. And it is very important because this project is a bridge between biodiversity preoccupation and climate preoccupation. We want both address it. The project are run by NGOs, local authorities, businesses, private and public sector. So it is a very large. 15 projects are going on in France, in European France, and also in overseas department, New Caledonia, Guadeloupe, and so on. And what do? We start at the beginning of the first step of the project, and we support the project from the beginning to the end. We will monitor it until 250 with very strong but robust and simple indicator. We both support them with technical and financing subsidies. Subsidies coming from the CDC group, but also subsidies coming from the businesses. We have already 60 private companies in France. We want to support that as a philanthropic exposure. And for that, we have created our own foundation, but also public subsidized by the local authorities, especially in urban areas. And I think it is a good one. And as Umberto said, it is a project that in France is part of the Life Artisan project, which is supported by the European Commission. And I think it will be a good demonstration. What can I say more? The projects are also very, for this 50 projects, 22 of them are run by farmers in agroforestry and agroecology. And it is a good demonstration that biodiversity and agriculture can work together. And with the economic organization of the French farmer, Umberto, we have developed a special footprint for every farm in France. And the first experience is made in the western part of France with the Cooperative of France, which is the economical organization of the farmers. And they are okay to assess their own exploitation with 15 biodiversity criteria. And I think that it is a good thing to take all the farmers with us on most of them, if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc. So I think that we know that it's necessary to have measurements of biodiversity impacts. I understand that there are tools that exist, for instance, the GBS and other tools that can be developed at different levels, and I come back to what Eva said. These measures are important to be able to internalize externalities, as economists say. And I would like to know, Eva, does EIB finance biodiversity projects with its usual financial tools, applying this type of measures, or have you put in place specific instruments dedicated to these projects? And if yes, can you describe a little bit, develop a little bit on that topic?
Thank you, Sophie. So yes, traditionally we've been using the same types of instruments that we use to finance, projects contributing to any of the SDGs and or infrastructure, right? So it's a combination of either loans, equity, and certainly blended finance, as well as some of the public-private partnerships that you may find within the blended finance family. In effect, I mean, the challenges are the same as the challenges of financing climate adaptation, right? Because they're very local, they're very small, they are not always, the cash flow is not always that evident, and certainly not in the amount, or the revenues are not in the amount that would bring in automatically your traditional institutional investors. So it's then also looking at the fact that our instruments do finance large infrastructure, have been geared to traditionally finance large infrastructure. And we find that especially on the natural capital biodiversity side, they are much smaller and are much more community driven. Certainly in developing countries, that is the case. And therefore, how do you get the financing down to the community level without having, also the heavy-handedness of all the administrative steps and financial steps and risk management requirements incorporated in such loans? Of course, we can finance through intermediaries such as credit lines, but that also doesn't always solve the problems. So something that we have been testing, there are two areas that we are increasingly looking at to finance not only climate adaptation, but certainly biodiversity, is looking at the market, and the market moving towards what you are seeing is sustainability linked instruments, and notably looking at the bond market, because that would allow probably to allow us to aggregate all these smaller projects, maybe even take an ecosystem-based approach. But it's associated with different challenges, meaning that you need to make sure that you have the appropriate standards. The problem with sustainability linked instruments is that it may be linked to a specific target, right? So it could be SDG 14 or SDG 15, but it is not linked to the use of proceeds, which goes, let's say, against our nature as an institution that would only finance a bond that is really clearly linked and targeted to a use of proceeds. So this is something that we are exploring, and increasingly so, but we think that this would be an instrument that could aggregate. But talking about aggregation, what we are trying to pilot, and certainly with UNEP under the Great Green Wall initiative, is taking that landscape and ecosystem approach. So having a whole slew of different actors around it. So you are looking at water quality, you're looking at soil, land, erosion, you're looking at biodiversity, restoring nature. So you have so many multiple within an ecosystem and within a landscape, and seeing how we can pilot that landscape approach, using, of course, blended finance, and traditionally also probably looking at specific types of equity funds. And one good example that we are exploring is, for example, the Coral Reef Fund that has been set up by UNEP together with other institutional investors and financiers such as BNP Paribas. But all this, and this is unfortunately the bane of the institutions as the EIB, this needs to be linked to technical assistance and to grant financing being available. And that is something that we don't naturally have. And therefore, the key is really partnering, and this public-private partnership, where you either partner with foundations who have that grant funding, or with organizations such as other NGOs or bilaterals that come in with the concession of finance, and we will come in with then the investment. And then one final point that I do want to make is a lot of these investments need to be done within the context of an enabling environment, because at the moment they're relatively small, and if you do not have that enabling environment to which governments are responsible for, such as revisiting agricultural policies, trade tariffs, developing those taxonomies that we are seeing right now in the EU, the definitions for what is nature positive are absolutely critical, because without those definitions, and I think Marc also mentioned measurement frameworks, so MRV frameworks need to be there, then they cancel each other out. So we are not going to get the impact that we really do want and need.
Thank you, Eva. So I understand that you have devised, you can use your instruments, you adapt them to the specificities of biodiversity projects, but it seems always a little bit difficult to intervene without grants or technical assistance. So I would like to turn to Marc, and maybe from an operator perspective, do you think it's possible to devise bankable nature-based projects, or are there obstacles you encounter? And could you provide us maybe with an example and your analysis on this?
Thank you. Yes, there are many obstacles, and to run a bankable nature-based solution, as we say at the CDC Biodiversity, you must be a little bit stubborn. You should be stubborn. But it is possible. It is possible, and I agree with Eva. You need to have a global approach and to try to put together many stakeholders, many information, and many technical problems. And I think that, first of all, a technical assistance by the European Commission, by the local authorities, or like the CDC in France, is very, very necessary, because it is very difficult to find the good project at the good moment, at the good place, and to be sure this project will be able to go to the end, not to be 1 day or 1 month or 1 year. And for that, I insist that we need to have a long-term approach. In France, as Sophie knows better than me, the CDC say we must have a long-term approach for that kind of project. As an example, to finance the wetland restoration, the CDC in France proposed 50-year loans, 50 years long. And I think it is necessary to have this, as 30 years, it is a short time, maybe for some project. And 40 is middle term, and 50 or 60 years, it is a problem. You also have to put together many concerning people that don't agree with nature-based solution at the beginning. You must to convince them that it is better for the local, better for the nature, and also better for the project as itself. And for that, you must take your time, but also to be as clear as possible on, I told you yesterday, Eva, the return of invest or such project, it is not luxury industry. You must have a goal between 2 and 5% at the beginning. And it is also for that blended solution are the good solution. You must divide the risk between the public authorities and the private companies, but also because regulation, public regulation is important, and the local tax system on nature will be the most important question in many countries for the years coming. So you have to have the good balance between the regulation, the loans, the equity, and also the taxes. And that is the real blend project we are supporting. And I agree with you that we need to have a way to have a mutualization. That's what we are doing in France. I don't know if it is possible to do the same in other countries in Europe, but we take projects with a low profile for finance, and some projects are better, and we can find partners. And we are very proud because in September, we will launch a project with private investor for offsetting. It will be the first time in France that we will do that, with a CDC group at the end, and the other end, a private group. And also, I think that two more reasons for blinded approach. You must avoid greenwashing. So I think that the public part of the project is the guarantee that it will not be a greenwashing project. And also, as Umberto said, it is a guarantee that the project will be put in the whole area, taxonomy, TNFD, CSRD, and so on, to take all the picture of biodiversity and so on. And also, to have the local authority with you is, as I told you yesterday, Eva, the land acquisition on the land loan for a long time is a key question to have the guarantee that the project will be good at the end. And to have that in Europe and in most part of the overseas department of France, you must have the local authorities with you to be sure that the land will be sustainable for a very long time and not become a private problem. It is better to have a clear acquisition of that.
Thank you. So two main takeaways from your interventions, Mark and Eva. The first one is that, for me, the first one is that if you are stubborn, you can make it. So that's pretty good news. The other one is that you need an enabling environment. And so maybe I would like to turn to Umberto to end with this first part of our roundtable and open then the floor to the questions. But Umberto, at the European level, what type of measures could the European Commission adopt in order to channel more financing towards nature-based or biodiversity conservation projects? So the other panelists gave some ideas. So I would like to hear you about this, and maybe also the way you see the role of long-term investors. Long-term is of essence, as Mark reminded us. So how do you see the role of public long-term investors in this area? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I do think that a lot of the deliverables and follow-up of the Green Deal and biodiversity strategy gives the steer in this direction, but I'll pick the recent example of the EU Nature Restoration Law, because the proposal is setting binding targets for member states in the short, mid, and long term, so to 2030, 2040, 2050. And they addressed a very broad range of EU ecosystems, from protected habitats that should get to favorable conservation statuses from the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive, but they don't have a deadline. Now we bring in the deadline, but also to a series of non-protected habitats where we suggest that we need positive trends on some indicators. For instance, in farmland ecosystems, in forest ecosystems, in cities, for pollinators and so forth. So I think the main message, well, first, restoration is a very strong word. It links with this need to go indeed beyond no net loss and going towards a regenerative society and economy, because we are destroying for too long. We have just accelerated since the 50s of last century, but so it's time to put it back. And its restoration gives an element of hope, which is fundamental to feed a political agenda. You cannot build a political agenda based on doomsaying or that everything will be worse. So there's something that can be better, which is the restoration. So this long term to begin with is there. But then I think Eva said it, climate change is global, biodiversity is local. Yes, first you do have the strong link biodiversity, climate change. You cannot address one without the other. So biodiversity helps to link the local with the global by one side. But second, for nature restoration and protection and so forth, we need a lot of subsidiarity, meaning allowing the right role for the member states. And that's what's in the proposal. We ask the member states to plan their own nature restoration plans where they can choose the methods. This is binding for the member states, it's not necessarily binding for the landowners. So the tools, incentives, avoiding perverse subsidies, replacing by good subsidies, taxes, easements, contracts, partnerships, there's a whole set of instruments that member states can adopt to steer into the right direction. And also, just to mention one important point on this, and Mark referred to this, actually both Eva and Mark referred to measuring the impacts. And of course, measuring the impacts is fundamental first to put a price on the destruction, on the business as usual, on the non-action. But measuring, and I'm here thinking again about farmers and foresters, is also fundamental to show the positive impacts. And there are many cases where scoreboards, indicators, etc., are used, allowing farmers to decide better how they manage their land, but then you can have a result-based payment scheme where they'll get a surplus, provided they have, in adding to their crops, these further crops, which can be birds, pollinators, butterflies, or whatever else. So these keywords, agroforestry, agroecology, and measurement is very relevant. But maybe the final comment now here is, yes, it's true. Well, let's speak the CAP strategic plans. The letters of observation of the Commission on the member states draft CAP strategic plans are public, and we have brought criticisms of several kinds a bit to all. And if we look to the recovery and resilience plans, well, we could often find that more on biodiversity could be there. What I think now can be a bit of a game changer is this restoration approach, not as putting reserves everywhere, by no means. It's just on bringing back solutions that derive from nature, including for the economy, including for jobs, including for food security, that will, I hope, bring this new trend towards the member states themselves, the regions, picking it up. Maybe I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. So maybe it's high time for questions. You can write your questions, post your questions in writing, and I will read them. For the moment, I have one question about the natural capital financing facility that you mentioned, the one or the other. So can you, the question is, can you tell us more about your experience from this natural capital financing facility and what lessons can help in terms of scaling up investments in nature? So I don't know who is going to take it, maybe the three of you, starting with Umberto, maybe?
I can start. I'm sure Eva noticeably can add more. First, my feeling, honestly, is the following. It was a pilot on a difficult area because it's easier to say let's invest in nature than to really put it in the market terms. I love several of the projects that were approved, from forests to offsetting, the one by CDC on green urban and their benefits. So the package is not immense. I don't remember exactly how many, but from my point of view, successful. But now what we've seen is, let's say, the death rate was big. For many of the projects that were in the pipeline did not make it for one reason or the other, and I've already identified some of the reasons. Scale, land acquisition can be an issue, how to make it bankable, and so forth. So that's where the getting the scale and especially getting the right level of technical assistance and follow-up is fundamental, both in pre-approval and post-approval. That's why we are putting more money now from LIFE into this technical assistance into InvestEU. But again, maybe Eva or Mark will wish to add more than I can say. You're muted, Eva.
I'll pass on the word to Mark because as one of the implementers of one of those projects, I think you have more insights because I think, Umberto, you've raised most of the elements that I would have put forward.
So yes, as Umberto said, we had a very strong support from the NCFF, and it was for a very innovative project in south of France, for the first and for the moment the only one national site for compensation, which is a big site for offsetting, and it was a real difficulty for economical reason. And if I haven't been a subsidiary from the CDC, I don't think the project will be going on, and the EIB support and from the Commission, because we have signed with the Commissioner at this time. I can't remember his name, Umberto, but you were there. It was a real support. So my point of view, as Roberto says, that the land acquisition or the land is a problem. You must support the land acquisition or to have to finance a very long-term loan for the acquisition. Second, you must admit, and Eva, you have said that before, that it is possible to have one financer and many projects. And so to have to put together a platform, I don't know, or to have an operator dedicated to that. And also, but it was, I think it was in the NCFF, technical assistant is very, very important because there are many small projects run by local companies or local authorities or local NGOs or a group of these three members, and you must have a clear approach that it is very difficult to find the good way to conduct a nature-based solution project. And as Umberto said, life assistant is good, but life is not enough because it is not a long-term finance. So you need to have a long-term finance. I must insist, maybe I'm a little bit stubborn, but many people know that I am stubborn, but you must have a long-term approach.
I think that will be the word of the end of this dialogue. Very fruitful and very rich. So long-term approach. Many a very challenging issue, but if you are stubborn, the term has been employed once again. You can make it. So it's also a very positive lesson to be drawn from this very interesting discussion. So I would like to thank you very much for your participation in this panel. Thank you to the EIB, which organized this lunch dialogue. Thank you to the panelists, of course. And also thank you for the audience, the members of the audience who listened to us with great attention, I am sure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.